The wind off the shivering sea carried the smell of old ice and brine, and Jon Snow breathed it as if it might scour the last ashes from his throat. He had gone far beyond the ghost woods, beyond the last forgotten cairns of the first men, where the frost-gnarled pines thinned to wiry scrub and the earth became a ledger of shale and frozen peat. Ghost ghosted ahead, white as a lost ember, leaving no sound in the world but the rasp of Jon's breath and the unhuman cry that answered him from the north. He had heard it first 3 nights past, at the edge of sleep. Not a wolf's call, not the scraping shriek of an ice eagle, not the moan of tired ice. This was deeper, layered, the echo of a mountain unburdening itself. It threaded his dreams and dragged him upright. He told himself it was only the wind swallowing itself in the hollows, only a raven's trick, only his own hollow wants. Still, he packed what food he had and rode, not for a settlement or a hunt, but as men ride when they know a thing has turned to face them at last. The world narrowed to cold and distance. Days lost their names. He followed the sound as if it were a taut cord, and the ghost silver sky contracted until it spilled into a hidden veil carved like a bowl by ancient ice. Wind scoured across its lip and rattled through ribs of half-buried stone. In the basin below, black soot smeared the snow in a great ring, as if a star had fallen and struck the world until it bled heat. Ghost stopped on the ridge and stared. Every hair along his spine prickled upright. Jon slid from the saddle and crouched, cradling the battered hilt of Longclaw in his palm as if it had gone warm. There were tracks, massive, splayed, melted to ice and refrozen, stretching across ash as dark as a hardened wound. A charred length of pine lay in the ring's center, peeled to bone by fire. The smell rising from it unmade the years between him and a girl on a dragon. Sunlight poured like molten coin across her hair. Drogon, Jon said. He did not mean to. The name left him like something that had waited behind his teeth. The veil answered with a breath that was no wind at all. Snow lifted in a halo and filtered downward in glittering veils. The light went strange, and then a second breath rolled through him, deeper, older, rhymed with scales and desert heat and the long patience of mountains. When the dragon rose from behind the landslide of broken stone, the world rearranged itself around him. Black wings unfurled and drank the sky. The ridge shuddered when he sat down in the basin, and the ash ring flurried into a storm that cleared as quickly as it came. Drogon's eyes were coals rimmed in old gold, flicking sunlight, the same as Jon remembered and nothing like it, too, for there was desert in them now and fever, a map of places beyond the bones of the world. Ghost pressed against Jon's leg, silent. The dragon cocked his head, as a hawk does, and lowered it until one eye was level with the ridge. Jon's hand found Ghost's scruff. He did not reach for Longclaw. He could not have explained why. He was bone-tired of steel doing what steel does. Drogon, Jon said again, and the name steadied his tongue. He did not say, "I am sorry." He did not say, "Forgive me." Words had been tithed to the dead. In that silence he felt something that was not forgiveness and not absolution. The dragon's breath washed over him, hot and rank and spiced with a scent that tugged at him in some deep cellar of his blood. It was the smell of sackcloth and summer, of black stone baked until it sang, of old fire cupped carefully against the wind of too many winters. The dragon turned his head, not away but toward a cleft where the slope had slumped. He lowered himself as if inviting a nearer look. Jon climbed down the ridge, each step measured, each step feeling like the first plank in a bridge he had not believed could be built. He slid, caught himself, and waded through ash until he stood within a sword's length of the creature he had once watched burn a city bright as a field of wheat. The cleft was a shallow cave, where snow had calved away from stone. Within it, shielded by Drogon's bulk, lay a bed scraped together from char and moss. In that bed were shapes that at first made no sense, bowls of obsidian perhaps, or river stones grown wrong. Then a tremor ran through one, a quiver like the twitch of a newborn's lip, and a hairline fissure spidered across its shell. A sound like a wet candle popped. Jon knelt. The egg's surface was black, not the glassy darkness of obsidian but something softer, textured, as if it had been woven from smoke. A shard lifted, a snout, small as a thumb and bright with moisture, pressed through. It squeaked. There was no other word, and the squeak climbed into a hungry complaint that punched a hole through everything Jon had done to himself to keep from wanting. Drogon's rumble gave the air weight. He lowered his wedge of a head until his eye filled the cave mouth. The hatchling wriggled free of its shell with the graceless courage of all new things, collapsed upon its own damp wing, then righted itself and snapped without knowing at the air. The next egg ticked. The third shivered. The bed was a chorus of small impatiences. Jon's hands moved without asking him. He tugged fragments away, freed a wing caught under a curve of shell, guided a slick little body toward the dry edge of the bed. He spoke nonsense, the soft, mindless string any man who has held a newborn learns in the space between two heartbeats. The words were not Targaryen words or Stark words. They were the language any creature answers when it is told without lying that it is safe. One of the hatchlings bit him because the world is honest. Its teeth were pinpricks that bled freely in the cold. Jon laughed, a sound that seemed to belong to someone who had not failed so many. The dragon's eye narrowed, not in anger. Jon was suddenly certain of that, but like a door pulled nearly shut again. A blizzard and left just enough ajar to say, "Come in, then, if you mean to." He stayed until the light thinned to iron and the cold crept up his sleeves and into his bones. He fed the hatchling slivers of dried meat from his pouch, and when Drogon took those slivers with careful patience and warmed them in his mouth and returned them, Jon did not think of burning, did not think of bells, did not think of the ruin of stone or the ruin of a girl he had loved the only way he knew, which was to end her. He thought only that some mercies arrive late and still must be accepted as if they were right on time. He stayed through the night. Ghost lay watchful, head on paws, eyes reflecting every ember spark in the dragon's gaze. When morning came, Jon saddled his horse and did not mount. He walked back to the wall along tracks he did not look at, carrying a hatchling inside his cloak because it had decided it belonged there. Drogon watched and did not stop him, and sometimes a choice not to stop is the oldest kind of blessing. By the time he returned to the ragged gate at Castle Black, the hatchling had imprinted its small heart upon him and upon everything he could not yet name. The brothers who remained gaped and shouted, and then the shouting snapped inward, became a sort of reverent quiet that did not belong to any god men had put to parchment. "He'll never fit in the cells," Tormund Giantbane said solemnly once the noise thinned, squinting at the little spade-headed creature peering from Jon's collar as if it had always been there. "He," Jon said, and then, caught by the absurdity of this fragile pronouncement, he said, "Or she. It's a bite with eyes," Tormund judged and grinned. "You've brought home trouble, Crow, but it looks to be the good kind." "Not for here," Jon said. He felt it like a compass under his ribs. "For here, nothing fits that flies. Inside walls, nothing fits that has tasted wind." It did not take long for the others to name the hatchling themselves. Men need to call a thing by something so it can be a story. These men called it Cinder, because it smoldered as it slept and because that was a word they owned. When the second hatchling came to the gate upon Jon's shoulder a week later, led from the Vale by Drogon's indulgent distance and Ghost's tracking nose, the name Ember stuck to it like warmth. When the third arrived, smaller, quick as a bell's flicker after a hammer falls, someone said spark and someone else said hiss, and then a boy who had been born on the wrong side of the world and had the right to his own poetry said Ashwing, and so Ashwing it was. They were too little for the wall. The wall was too little for them. Jon ran his fingers under hatchling chins and thought of the shape of a different world, of the weight of thrones and the weight of what men had placed upon them because they could not imagine a world that stood without a chair nailed in its middle. When the day came that Drogon descended not upon the ash bowl in the north but upon the wall itself, men ran as men run when the sky comes down. He did not breathe fire. He breathed air, and his beating of it threw men to their knees. He set himself upon the ice with the care of an old cat testing a thaw. He lowered his head. Jon walked to him. Ghost walked with him. Cinder leapt from Jon's shoulder, landed on Drogon's brow ridge, and clung there, squeaking, complaining, demanding, telling the story of its day. "I need to go south," Jon said to the dragon, knowing the dragon did not need words to know what a man intended. "But not as I went before." Drogon's eye rolled like a tide. He swung his head toward the river of blue ice stretching southward into other lives. He drew in a breath and let it out in a sound like old bronze, like someone drawing a whetstone along a blade until it is honest again. Jon understood. The dragon would go where he led, not to lift a king but to burn away what kept men kneeling when they had forgotten why. They flew when the thaw ate into the great ice and the rivers unknotted themselves. Jon did not say farewell. He was a brother who had broken too many oaths to pretend more, but he was also a man who understood that farewell was sometimes a way to make a thing heavier than it needed to be. Tormund would keep the gate. The brothers would watch the north, as if the north were a single door one could shut and walk away from. Ghost leapt up behind Jon on the saddle made of ropes and cured hides in time, and took his place with the stubborn grace of an old friend who refuses to be reassigned to memory. The sky opened. Drogon's wings harvested the light. Southward the world unrolled from a map back into a country you could taste. The ruins of Winterfell lay behind Jon like a scar he had decided not to scratch. Ahead, Sansa's rebuilt walls rose from new stones. They circled once. People ran, pointed, fell to knees or braced legs wide and tried to look brave. Jon saw his sister on the battlements, her hair like copper in a northern sun. He did not land. He dipped the wing Drogon understood. Sansa lifted her hand. That was a better greeting than anything that could be made of words, and it threw a rope across the widening distance between the lives they had chosen. They went to White Harbor for fish and awe, then to Gulltown, where the cliffs rang with the sound of bells, and then over the fingers and the trident and the field where ghosts never stopped shouting. Men had gathered in the years since the last war and polished their rules with their own breath until they thought those rules were bright. Jon saw their brightness for what it was: the sheen of oil on water before it burns blue. King's Landing came into view like a bite taken from an old loaf, torn, unpretty, eaten by the one who needed it most and fastest. The scorched and the rebuilt coexisted, a marriage that smelled of mortar dust and grievance. The Red Keep had been stitched back together in redder stone, as if color might blunt memory. The September was a memory itself. Markets had sprouted around its absence like weeds filling the print where a great beast had slept. They landed not in the Red Keep but on the broken hill where the Great Will had once been declared broken. Jon slid down Drogon's shoulder, boots skidding on warm scales, and walked without guards or banners into a city that had learned to count dragons as weather. The hatchlings rode his shoulders and a leather hoop at his back like curious children peering from a wagon. He went not to the throne room but to the square where fish were gutted and prices haggled in tones that carried old knife edges. He bought bread. He bought olives because he remembered a woman who had tasted them like a miracle after starvation. He fed the hatchlings little pieces and then fed the quiet that had formed in the square. "I am Jon," he said. He did not say Snow. He did not say Targaryen. Names were tools and he had misused too many. "I came because I have something to tell you and something to ask." Men and women looked at the dragons, at his face, at the sword. Some recognized him. Some knew only the story of a man who had killed a queen and been spared by politics and sent into an exile that became a rumor. He did not hold Longclaw high. He let it hang at his hip as if it belonged there without making a speech about it. "There has been a chair here," Jon said, "for longer than any of us can remember. Men have said it was needed because without it, no one would know who to listen to. They sat on it and asked others to die so that chair could remain the answer to a question none of them had asked properly." The murmurs rose, eddied, fell. Someone laughed, short and dry. Someone spit. Someone else crossed themselves in a way that did not belong to any god. "I have seen what a chair can make of a good heart," Jon said. "I have seen it turn mercy to weapon. I have seen it draw in those who want to bend it to others and those who want to be bent by it, because both can be a comfort. I have seen it burn a city and call it justice. If all thrones are the same, then what we need is not a better king, but fewer chairs." "Burn it again?" A woman with a scar down her cheek shouted. Is that your plan? Burn the room so there's nowhere to sit. No, Jon said. I will not burn your rooms. I will not burn anything for you. I will show you how to lock a door you forgot you could close. They did not stone him. They did not cheer him either. But the city had known worse plans shouting at it from worse men standing on higher stones. And so it listened because listening cost less than rebuilding again. By evening, those who called themselves council to the crown had arrived in the square, carried by litters or borne along by the certainty that their attendance would be taken and later used. Tyrion Lannister was absent, having left the city years prior to seek quieter places where a mind might be consumed without being noticed. The new hand was a banker from Braavos who had learned Westerosi words quickly and breathed them back in a way that made men think he had always belonged here. The crown itself rested upon no head. A council in Jon's time now ruled by consent, a wheel patched after breaking, rolling because no one yet had chosen to throw themselves beneath it. Jon did not go to them. He brought them to him instead, because dragons do not fit well in rooms designed by men who imagine their own importance in bricks. What do you want, then? The banker asked somewhere near midnight, when the last of the crowd had thinned to those who were either very interested or had nowhere else to go. To end your thrones, Jon said. All of them, the big one of iron, the little ones of habit. The throne in your guild house, the one in your head that says you must serve a single symbol or be nothing. You would undo what has built order, the banker said. You would leave an empty space men would rush to fill with something worse. Then do not leave it empty, Jon said. Fill it in. Build something in which weight is carried by many hands so that no one thinks that chair is a god. And the dragons? The banker asked, brittle now. You will enforce this flattening with your fire? A man with a sword and a dragon is an emperor whether he writes the word or not. I will do it with an absence, Jon said. I will take away what you think you need. The dragons will eat fish and air and cold. They will eat nothing of yours but fear. He went to the Red Keep at dawn. He went alone. Ghost trotted at his heels, the hatchlings humming along each breath as if they had invented it. Drogon came when the sun climbed to the height of the broken tower and set himself upon the courtyard with the gravity of a storm anchor. The guards fell back and forgot everything they had been told of standing firm before an emblem. The throne room had been remade narrower, perhaps in the hope that no one would remember how large it had once felt. Men think the shape of a room can argue with history. The Iron Throne loomed all the same, blade edges softened by new forging, the whole less savage and more elegant, as if taste could civilize the impulse that birthed it. Jon stood before it. For a long time, he did nothing but stand and listen to the rude patter of water somewhere behind the walls and the small scuff of Ghost's foot as he settled his weight. Sunlight filtered through remade windows made a filigree of dust. The sword at Jon's hip felt suddenly too much like a credential. I will not sit in you, he said quietly to the chair. I will not play at pretending you do not make men into weapons. He laid Longclaw across the steps. Then, without ceremony, he took off his gloves and lifted the smallest of the hatchlings. Spark, quick and nipping. He set it upon the arm of the throne. The hatchling cocked its head, hissed at the glinting edges, and then, curious, bit a BL. Ade. Its teeth found old iron that had learned the taste of men. Chewed. Ashwing joined it. Cinder slid down the back and made a small nest in the hollow where a king's spine would have rested. They did what all young creatures do to an object that has been told it is holy. They tasted it, climbed it, claimed it back to the world of simple things. Drogon's breath pushed through the door like a hand through a curtain. He did not set the throne ablaze. He laid his jaw upon the threshold and watched the hatchlings worry edges loose, watched them pry bits of legend into trinkets, and in that watching something that had been stuck broke free. Jon did not understand it with his mind. He felt it in the marrow, as if a pressure had eased, as if some long clench in the world had finally been unhanded. Workers came, blinking and whispering prayers they had invented for the occasion. Jon asked for hammers. He asked for chisels. He asked for water and patience. Then he stayed and did the labor himself, shoulder to shoulder with men who had never held a king's weight, knocking a myth apart until it was a pile of mundane salvage. The hatchlings played among the piles. Drogon watched. Ghost slept, tail flicking when a sliver skittered near his nose. The banker came and went, calculating the expense of sanctity. When at last the chair was no longer a chair but a heap of iron that had once been welded into a threat, Jon asked for molds, for a dozen of them, for hundreds. He asked for apprentices to be pulled from their beds. He asked for the city smiths to bring their craft and their stubbornness. "What would you forge?" a smith asked, wiping sweat and disbelief from his brow. "Nails," Jon said. "For doors. For roofs. For coffins too when needed, but for tables first. For fences and gates that open. For hinges. For plowshares if your iron will take the temper for it. Melt this down into enough pieces that no single man can put it back together, even if he waits 1,000 years for the right excuse." And so it was done, because the doing was not blasphemy but work, and men understand work. The throne dwindled into nails and hinges and coins with no king's face on them. Just a dragon curled around a sheaf of wheat, and a ship that had never known a master but the wind. Children played with bits brought home in pockets, and the old stories lost a tooth. Jon did not make a speech the day the throne became 1,000 useful things. Instead, he sent riders. He sent 100 messages written in a hand that could still go slow and careful when it needed to. To Winterfell, to the Eyrie, to Riverrun, to Casterly Rock, to Highgarden's ruins and Old Town's half-healed pride, to Sunspear where the sea frets the stone into its own shape, to Pike where men make thrones of rope and knife. He wrote no summons to bow. He wrote an invitation to stand together without inventing a chair to stand around. He called the gathering not a council and not a court. He called it a conclave because the word tasted like a closing that let something open inside it. He asked each house to send 3, 1 learned, 1 skilled with hands, 1 chosen by lot from among those who had never before been asked to stand in any hall for any reason except to be counted and taxed. He asked the free cities to send merchants willing to argue without bribes. He asked the Ironborn to send a woman if they had one, and if they didn't, to find the nearest man willing to listen, which might take them a while. They came. Curiosity drags more stubbornly than fear. The dragons were weather over the city, and people found themselves glad of the shade. The hatchlings grew in the weeks the city waited, shedding like children outgrowing their own names. Cinder began to beat the air with enough authority to rise to the level of the low towers. Ember learned to fold its wings precise as letters in a book. Spark learned how to fall and make falling a game. Ashwing preened itself with the dedication of a melody being tuned. When the conclave convened, it did so not in the throne room, but in the great mess of the city's restored granary. Because nothing a man says is worth more than bread. Jon stood at a long table not higher than any other table and broke a loaf with his hands and passed it to a woman from the Stormlands who had a farmer's wrists. He did not sit at the head because there was no head. "You will want a charter," said a maester from Old Town, with the gentle doubt of a man accustomed to codifying what he cannot quite imagine. "You will want laws to bind the laws. You will write what you need," Jon said. "You will write it with those who have never written law but live it every day. And you will write it knowing a dragon sleeps above our heads and will not burn the paper if you disappoint me, because I am no longer interested in making my disappointment holy." He watched the shock roll the room. He watched the relief after it. The banker from Bravos smiled the way a man smiles when someone else has agreed to be the first to leap from a height that might be survivable after all. "What if a lord refuses?" asked a knight with a gilded breastplate that had known little harm. "What if a city says no and closes its gates and begins to call its refusal a right? Then do not go there with swords," Jon said. "Go there with grain. Make a road where there is none and feed those who did not close the gate because they were never invited to touch it. Refusal will crack before hunger does." "And if they raise banners?" asked a lord whose grandfather had died with a shout on his lips. "If they call you weak and take it as permission to be cruel, then you raise banners too," Jon said. "But not to seat a king, to unseat cruelty. And when you are done, you do not build a throne from your victory. You build a table and you invite those who lost to eat at it if they will, or to go home if they must. If they will not, then you build a road through their house so that their neighbors can pass by without paying a tithe to their grievance. What will the dragons do? Asked a child from Flea Bottom, standing on tiptoe to see the hatchlings asleep on the rafters. John liked that the child had found a way in. Someone always must. They will hunt, John said. They will fly patrols to see where roads need building. They will warm the kilns for tiles and glass when there is no wood to spare. They will keep the winter clouds honest. They will learn the smell of plague so we can steer ships away. They will be afraid and bold and wrong and better. They will be what we teach them to be by being what we say we are. In the days that followed, the conclave argued loud and long and foolish and wise. John learned the sound of flour being measured into politics. He learned that a woman who had never left her island could say a true thing about horses that saved a caravan 3 weeks later from breaking an axle in a place where men would have died if they were not careful or lucky. He learned that a boy chosen by lot from a village that had no well but one, whose father had been skinned slowly by taxes, could stare down a lord when the change in his pocket meant the difference between seeing winter and becoming it. And he could do it without venom because he had been given a chair that was not carved into a crown. The first change was small. The guild fees were reweighted so a mason and a thatcher and a seamstress could afford to be legal. The second change was a map. They drew roads not from thrones to other thrones, but from granaries to mills to fords to villages that had been too far from anything but their own bad luck. The third was a reckoning. They tallied not how many men each house could raise, but how many children had died before their names were kept. Drogon flew at dusk and at dawn, and sometimes he flew at night, his wings writing patient, dark sentences across the stars. The hatchlings learned formation, then forgot it because forgetting is how learning becomes your own. Once, a storm came down the narrow sea and pounded the city into slickness, and the dragons slid down through the rain like knives through cloth to settle upon the granary roof and lash their tails and chuff at thunder. The city did not kneel. It laughed, and then it slept with a tiredness that belonged to honest work. Not every place welcomed nails and maps. In the Riverlands, a clutch of small lords raised their old banners and tied their old arrogance to their new hunger. They called the conclave a foreign trick. They called John a usurper twice over, though he had not once in these months called himself anything at all. They rode upon villages that had dared to build their own council houses and burned those houses down. They took a road stone by stone because the road meant people could pass them without asking permission. John went with the dragons. He went without song or fanfare, because those always arrive on their own when there has been a season of quiet. He did not drop fire. He did not even let Drogon scream. He landed in a field and waited while men came to circle him like dogs testing which part of the bear to bite first. "You think we fear you," said the First Lord, bold with the desperation of someone who has bet a house against the weather. "We do not. We have buried too many to give that gift to any man." "You fear something," John said. "It might be hunger, or it might be that no one will need you if a road goes around your table." The lord's jaw clenched. They looked at the dragons the way a man looks at fire when his hands are numb and he has convinced himself he deserves to stay cold. "What do you say to those who say that a broken throne is still a throne, held by a man who pretends not to sit?" "I say that if you must name a man's absence a kind of sitting," John said, "then you have told me what you worship, and it is not order. It is the shadow of a chair across your own feet. Step out of it. The son does not belong to the throne." He did not threaten. He did not have to. The dragons sat behind him and made an argument for the weather. They were too large and too alive to be a weapon of any one man for long. This was the thing John had begun to understand. Thrones domesticate power into a room. Dragons refuse rooms. If they are to remain themselves, they must remain partly unruled. When men see that, some will hate it and some will be relieved of a burden they had mistaken for a birthright. The lords would not move. They would not sit at any table unless it was high and their feet above someone else's shoulders. So John built a road in front of them. He brought men with spades and women with sacks and children with ropes to tug stones into place. He camped there, and he let the dragons warm the nights without burning the tents. He watched the line of the road approach the village these lords had starved, and watched the people of that village come out with bowls and contribute stone and help their own future toward themselves. He watched the lords watch their power become a thing people could walk past. When the road reached the village gate, the lords raised their banners and rode. They had to. This was the old argument. Jon rose, too, and Drogon rose with him, but no fire left them. Jon drew Longclaw, and the sword asked him why, and he answered, because some men have built their lives so tight around hurt that only steel can open them again. He did not kill the lords. He cut straps and girths in certainty. He knocked men from saddles and told them to look up at the sky while they lay there and notice it had not changed its color even though their pride had fallen. He was not gentle, and he did not pretend otherwise. Mercy is not the same as softness, and he was too tired to lie to himself or anyone else about that any longer. In time, the Riverlands learned to live with the road, because grain travels better than vanity and why. Tur accepts no excuses. In time, other banners lowered themselves not because a dragon had cast a shadow across them, but because it had become embarrassing to be seen insisting on a chair when other men were doing useful things with the wood. Sansa wrote from Winterfell in a hand made sure by weather. She told him of a council of her own, smaller, with every village sending a woman and a man and a boy not yet grown but old enough to take responsibility for what he said aloud. Arya wrote from a place with a name that could not be spelled by Westerosi mouths. And when she had no words for wonder, she sent drawings of boats with wild sails and of children whose eyes were so dark they invented a new superstition in her. Bran did not write. Sometimes, at dusk, Jon felt a bird's gaze that included him without naming him. Seasons turned and the dragons grew. They learned the smell of fever and the shape of flood and the taste of locusts and wind. They learned to rattle their scales when they came upon an army drilling so that men would look up and remember how small their fights were beside a sky with room for dragons. They learned to turn their heads away when men brought them babies to bless. Jon learned to stand beneath them and remind himself that he had been wrong about so many things and that this did not prevent him from being right about some, particularly the simple ones. He found forgiveness when he was not looking for it. Not from gods, from people. A woman whose husband had died in the burning of the city brought him an olive and called it even. A boy whose mother had starved in the aftermath came to ask him to tell the story of the day the throne became nails. And when Jon did not make himself a hero in the telling, the boy laughed and said, "Good, because heroes are too heavy for children to carry." A man from the Unsullied who had stayed behind when Grey Worm sailed, because the sea meant nothing to a boy stolen in a market, asked if he might guard the granary and nothing else. Jon said yes and then asked him, in return, to teach 3 boys to stand as still as he did, because stillness is a craft. There were setbacks. A small city in the Reach declared itself sovereign and began minting coins with a man's head on one side and a chair on the other, the legend around the edge reading, "Order." The coins were pretty. People liked them. Pretty things are harder to argue with than ugly ones. Then a flood came, and the chairs made of stone became boats within a day or two of honest doubt. The city opened its gates and let the road pass through. Jon sent new maps. He aged. He learned that leadership is a verb that looks like shipping lists and sore backs. He learned to laugh with his men and to bow his head with women who had been hurt by men like him and had decided to keep going anyway. He learned that the dragons belonged to no one. He learned to belong to the work instead of to the symbol. Ghost grew stiff in the hips and still refused to leave Jon unless there was a crisis or a stew pot. The hatchlings became not hatchlings and then, in a way Jon had not expected, became hatchlings again. Not smaller, but fresh, discovering that a world with few thrones had more perches than a man could count. One winter evening, in a village north of the Trident where the Conclave had funded a bridge built by hands that had never before believed they could shape stone into obedience, Jon stood with his cloak full of snow and listened to the far-off belling of ice groaning along its own inconvenience. And he felt the old ache for a person he had loved. He did not call her name. He said only quietly, "I hope you see this." Drogon lifted his head from where he had placed it near the hearth, stealing heat with the innocence of something too large to know there are rules for stoves. He made a sound low in his chest and then a second sound like a suggestion. Jon went outside and looked up. The sky was iron-bright and clear to the hinge of the world. Above, the lights moved. The green and violet curtains that come when the air decides to remember that it can be beautiful for no reason that helps anyone survive. The dragons rose, all four, and wrote their shadows across that light like men signing their names with a flourish after they have finally stopped apologizing for their own existence. Jon laughed, a sound like a stone dropping into a well and finding water. He had ended no throne alone. He had helped others end the need for them. He had learned to make of power a weather and of weather a harness only when necessary. He had learned to use absence as emblem. It all felt, at last, less like making history than like clearing a field of stones so someone else could plant. In the spring, the conclave convened again in King's Landing, and this time they met in a building that had never been a palace. It was a long house with many doors and no dais. Children ran through it with bread. A woman from Dorne stood up and proposed a law that said no man might claim another man's oath by saying a word while standing above him, because height is a perilous drug. A fisherman's wife seconded it. A maester wrote it down with a shaking hand that knew how long it would take for a rule like that to do its slow magic. The banker found himself smiling without calculation and failed to stop in time. When the petitioners finished, a boy who had been chosen by lot from a dockside tenement stood. He said he had no question. He said he had a story. He told them of a night when two men had come to his building with knives to collect rent that had not been earned by any labor but cruelty. He said that the road that had been built past their door had made it possible for his mother to trade her bread farther, and how the men with knives had come less often because other men came with grain and ideas, and there were suddenly too many eyes and too many maps for a little tyranny to breathe. He said he had seen a dragon once, and had thought of fear, and the next time he had thought of winter and of roofs, and that this felt better. When the boy sat, Jon did not speak. He walked outside into a city that did not yet know how to be anything but itself and stood in the sun. He let the noise wash him. He let himself be only another man in a place that no longer needed a single point to explain it to the sky. Drogon lowered his head into the street, as if asking for an onion. Someone offered him one. He ate it. He made a face. The city laughed, proper laughter, the kind that turns strangers into neighbors. At dusk, on the broken hill where the chair had once pretended to be a solution, Jon gathered the nails no one had used and placed them in a sack. He sent them with riders to places where there were still doors that needed to be hung. He kept one and pressed it into the wall of a house, half finished by hands that had never before believed a wall could keep out cold without keeping them in. He stood there with the hammer in his hand and felt the blow travel up his bones and thought, "This is the right weight." Ghost nudged his knee. Jon scratched the old wolf's ear. Overhead, the dragons stitched the evening together with their lazy circuits. And for the first time since he had been a boy at Winterfell, Jon looked at a sky and could not find a throne inside it. He found only weather and work and the ordinary holiness of a table where bread was being cut without any need to count how many seats there were to prove that the room mattered. He slept that night in a narrow bed not his and woke not to bells or to alarms but to a child singing to a chicken. He rose and he ate and he worked, and when the work paused because weather has its own schedule, he went to the granary and listened to those who had never been listened to before. In the afternoon, he walked the new road out of the city until the heat softened and the dust took on that faint sweetness it has when it has not yet decided which way to settle. And he met a caravan heading north with seeds and saws and a confidence that did not need escort. He raised his hand. The lead driver raised his back. No oaths, no titles. Enough. On the ridge beyond the road, Drogon stretched and yawned. A great house cat made of forgotten ages, and the three younger dragons came tumbling over him like children who had foregone every throne for the reckless and unapologetic pleasure of belonging to a sky too wide to be ruled by any one seat. Jon watched them for a time, and then he turned toward the work that waited and would always wait, because that was the point. That it should not be done by one man, but by many hands over and over, without a crown at the center to make it seem precious. He walked, and the road held. He walked, and the dragon's shadows drifted over fields where no chair cast a shadow deeper than a fence post. He walked and found that ending thrones had not ended the world, but only changed its posture. so that it stood straighter and breathed easier and looked at its children without calculating what they owed before they had eaten. He walked, and the north wind smelled of new timber and cooled iron, and he knew that this time, at last, what they were building was not a history of kings but a memory of work, which is to say, a future that did not need to be a story for anyone to eat well under it. Dawn did not so much break as soften. The cold rinsed out of the air until it tasted of clay and worked hemp. John walked the line where the new road left King's Landing and shouldered through a knot of tradesmen arguing cheerfully over whose wagon would take the crown of the road and whose would keep to the verge for the sake of hubs and temper. The dragons glided low enough to make canvas ripple. Children reached up with both hands as if they might touch shadow. He learned to recognize the sound of a town that had finally convinced itself it was allowed to persist. It was in the hammer strikes that settled rather than boasted, in the way dogs barked at strangers and then wagged their tails as if to say, "You will be ours soon enough." When he returned at sunset, grain dust had laid a gold skin over the square, and the baker had shaved the bottoms off loaves too dark for show and given the shavings to children with bowls and no coin. He slept lightly and woke to the measure of 100 small tasks in his bones. He worked until his back ached and then worked until the ache stopped being important. If this was rule, it was indistinguishable from chores. The thought pleased him more than any crown had ever pleased any man. Letters found him. They always do, once the world has remembered your name in a way that does not require you to sit above anyone. A raven from Winterfell, the familiar slant of Sansa's hand. Another from Old Town taken down by some neat-fingered novice who had copied his Archmiester's impatience into the curl of an S. A long roll of parchment from Bravos with a ribbon dark as the narrow sea. A scrap of hide from Pike Stiff with salt. He read Sansa first. It was not the words that steadied him, but the weather in them. The snow measured, the wolves counted, the stores tallied not as wealth but as winter's argument answered in advance. She wrote of a council where a shepherd had shamed a lordling into contributing stone to a causeway because the lord's wagons had rutted the field road in a thaw and ruined lambing pasture. She wrote of Arya's drawing. 3 sails with eyes on them and a coastline that was no coastline anyone in Westeros had named, and how she had hung it above the hearth because fire liked to look at new places. From Old Town the words were proud of their own learning. His Grace. If we are to use such honorifics as history has made ready to hand, for we have no others brewed up new yet, and language, like law, requires tools, may wish to know that the glass candles have burned 3 nights in a row now in 3 different towers, and that they burn steadier in the presence of the winged heat he keeps near him. We propose an inquiry.
Oui, propose-t-elle.
Which would you have first? It was signed by Archmaester Peristan in a script pruned of any flourish, and countersigned in a large confident hand that bulldozed the lines into usefulness. Marwyn. Bravos had a way of writing that made you hear the clink of coin even where the ink thinned. The banker's letter was shorter than his previous careful treatises, as if brevity were now a kind of courtesy his office enjoyed. It acknowledged receipts of grain and accounts of iron redistributed and asked for permission to issue notes against the nails that had once been a throne, because value, once melted and moved, must be taught its new ledger. It asked if a representative of the conclave would sit for a portrait to hang in the counting house, and promised that no crown would be painted upon any head. John smiled despite himself and wrote back that if the bank wished to hang a picture of a table with loaves and a wool-wrapped child gnawing a crust, that would do just as well. Pike's message was Asha's. Yara's, if you had learned your names from the South's broken tongue. And it cut the way a rope cut when hauled across the edge of a gunwale, efficient and honest. We will send not a woman because you ask it but because she earns it in the doing. We will burn no villages that pay fair, and we expect to be paid fair, clear ledgers, clear weather. If your dragons sing over our masts again in a way that makes men jump, we will shoot at them until our arms tire, and our arms do not tire quickly. Come and drink salt with us if you dare, and tell me to my face why a chair made of iron in a city that never saw the sea should have told us what to do with our oars. He went. It took him 10 days with weather behind him and maps that did not require a man to ask permission before he imagined the line from one place to the next. The dragons played tag with the gulls and then tired of the joke and ranged higher, where drafts carved invisible rivers. Pike rose from the sea with its old contempt for the mainland, the waves punching its rocks in a lesson repeated since the first tide remembered what it was supposed to do. Yara Asha met him on the quays with her hair in its own weather and her mouth set in a line that admitted neither deference nor performance. She offered him a dipped crust and a cup of something brown that smelled like a bruise. He drank it. She laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "Do you know why we climb?" she said without preface, leaning against a bollard as if the sea were an ally of hers and he, perhaps, a thing to be tolerated if he did not pretend to own it. "And you people in your castle spread? It's not only the rock and the water. It's the lesson. When you climb, your feet do not lie to you. A slip and you die. A silly king in a silly chair can pretend to be skill. Rock will not pretend with you. I have seen chairs lie to men until those men forgot they had feet," Jon said. "I have seen women drag themselves from beneath them like men from under a broken cart." She said. "You did a thing that will be a story our children tell when they want to be kinder to their fathers than their fathers deserve. But if you give them another chair, they'll dress it in the dragon's shadow and think that makes it honest." "I have no chair to give," Jon said, "and less patience than that for those who would build one behind my back while telling me the nails are for doors." "Good," she said. "Then here's my part. I'll sign your ledger and wager ships against your roads. We'll take fish where fish are and bring wood where wood is not, and let the conclave measure our oaths in anchors and cargoes. But don't ask my men to bow to a table. If a man wants to lean on it, make sure it can bear the weight and that the bread on it is worth the walking. That's all. Also, tell your dragons that rope is not a snake. Ember took a coil yesterday and worried it until a mast came down, and the men called it luck that no one died. She owes me a mast. I'll take the debt in stories told straight." He told them straight. He drank more and watched the long, low shape of the world tilt as the tide did its ancient thing. He slept without dreaming of chairs, and woke to a sky with room in it for gulls and dragons both, and the thought that none of them required blessing. On the flight south, he dropped to the citadel at Old Town and found it changed in small ways that meant more than ceremony. The novice who met him wore a belt with no link and no shame. His eyes were clear and quick, as if he read the world now as a text he was allowed to annotate. In the vaults, a candle burned with a soft determination, and men took turns sitting beneath it with the patience of those who had learned that mystery can be touched without being murdered into explanation. Archmaester Marwyn smelled of smoke and stubbornness. He led Jon to a window from which the city could be seen making the same mistakes it had made yesterday with a little more elegance. "There were always glass candles," he said, as if they were discussing weather. "We were always too dull to admit light to itself. You brought heat and story and called both work, and that made our reluctance unbeautiful." "I brought dragons," Jon said. "They brought themselves." "Ha!" Marwyn said. "So speaks a man who knows tools. Listen, Septon Barth was not wrong." He pulled a book down, not for Jon to read, but so he could hold it and talk to it as much as to the man before him. He wrote that dragons change as they need, male one year and female the next, because that is what fire does when it remembers it must exist or perish. "Your Drogon laid eggs?" "He did. He did not until he did. Don't argue with it. The world is not a census taker. Now," he tapped the window, knuckle clicking against glass, "the faith will wake. It has been hammered flat by grief and will take that as righteousness. The old men will say you are remaking Baelor's cruelty with better manners. They will claim the throne grew back because you melted it into the roofs. They will say winter comes sooner because dragons warm the air. Are you ready to be blamed for the weather?" "I have always been blamed for weather," Jon said. "It snowed wherever I went until it didn't, and then that was my fault also. Let them come. I cannot set a table for every grief. Only set one for the ones that can be fed." Marwyn grunted, which might have been praise. "There is fever on the Saffron Way," he said, brisk now. "It rides rain and the palms love it, and then men die in clusters and women haul water until they fall down and drown. We will need heat without smoke to burn contaminated cloth in 10 dozen villages without forests. If you mean to turn dragonfire into civic use, Do it where it will be obscene not to. The faith will howl. Good. Let them practice howling and get it out of their throats before they remember how to sharpen knives. Jon went where fever went. It had begun near the Dornish marches, where the air trapped itself low to the soil, and the flies learned men the way they had learned horses centuries ago. He did not ride into towns as a deliverer. He rode to the edge and pitched tents. He sent men to the wells and stood at the mouth of them, and the dragons lowered their heads to the well rims, and the air went very still while the beasts breathed and listened. When Ember snuffed and pulled back sharply, he knew she had found the smell that meant plague and death braided together. They burned rag piles to sterile ash, and the smell of burning never crossed a threshold. They heated pots until they rang and hammered lids that had never fit quite right until they did. He stood in heat haze and listened to women tell him precisely how to help and how to stay out of the way, and he obeyed even when his body wanted to lift a load just to feel useful. The faith came. It had to. It would have been a failing of lore if it had not. Not an army, not yet. A procession of men in plain robes with the old signs stitched small where men with swords might not see them at first. They did not forbid the burning of rags. They did not forbid the boiling of water. They forbade the dogs from lying beside the sick, because there is always a rule meant to make suffering tidy. Jon listened. He let the dragons sleep 2 fields over. When the eldest of the Septons had finished his speech about modesty as medicine, Jon said, "If you tell a child to go away because his love is messy, he will grow up and learn to hate better than you ever learned to pray." He said it quietly, and the men heard quiet and mistook it for meekness. "What do you know of prayer?" The eldest asked, swollen with the dignity of someone who had kept to a catechism through war, as if keeping to it were the cure for war. "What do you know of right? You killed a queen. You set a dragon to pull down a king's seat and called it piety. You have made yourself a blank and asked us to believe there is holiness in it." "I have killed," Jon said. "I have made a blank of myself and found that it was only a way to hide from the work. There is no holiness in me. There is bread. There is the lack of a chair. There is a nail with no weight but the door it holds. That is what I know. If you have a prayer that makes the water boil without fuel, teach it to me and I will say it every morning. If not, hand me that pot." The man did not hand him the pot. A woman did, without looking at either of them, because her child had begun to cough. Jon set the pot upon a stand they had rigged for this purpose, and Ember slid down the last of the air like an answer and placed her breath where it belonged. The water roiled. The faith watched, and some of them learned to pretend their disapproval was a kind of blessing, because men are good at pretending things they cannot control are the fruit of their own careful thought. Jon did not care. The water boiled just the same. He spent a season buying time from fever and learning the ways a dragon could be careful. The old men wrung their hands. The young ones worked. The women ignored everyone who was not carrying. When at last the rain slowed and the air lifted and the flies forgot men for a blessed month, he left the villages to their own strength. He left nails and maps and a new practice of leaving the doors open when the day was hot and the night cool. He left one of the conclave's scribes behind, a small woman from the Vale who had learned to put a fever onto paper in a way that showed where it would go next, and that this was power. On the road he met a column in the dust and knew it for what it was before he could count shields. A company of sellswords, old steel made new by hunger. Their captain bowed with only the top joint of his spine, enough to test whether Jon wished to be flattered. "We've a contract with no master," the man said brightly, as if he had discovered a joke that might pay him. A city thought it could be sovereign and then learned what sovereign meant when grain goes elsewhere. "We are, in brief, unemployed." "Hungry," Jon said. "Hungry," the man agreed cheerfully, "and not inclined to be pious about it. We will take work that does not require us to kill women and children. We will dig ditches without singing about it if there is coin at the end." "Dig ditches," Jon said. "Guard bridges while men forget how much they need them. Go to the reach where the flood cracked a causeway and make it level enough for mules. The conclave will write notes. The bank will honor them. When some lordling who misses his chair offers you twice to knock down what you've put up, remember that having your own story makes rotten bread." The captain glanced at the dragons, at the way Drogon's shadow lay like a fence across the road. "You've a peculiar way of being terrifying, my lord," he said after a while. "It's mostly receipts. Receipts can end empires," Jon said, "and feed children." The man said. "We'll try that first, then." He saluted with his helmet and marched his men back into their own dust, and the dragons lifted and knit the light together as if to say, "That will do." He went to Sunspear because he had never been able to imagine its bricks properly, and because Dorne kept its own counsel better than any place in all the wide maps he had learned to trust. He found heat that did not feel like punishment and a prince who had learned to be less interested in his title than in the color of his orchards. He found the sandship, some brilliant absurdity of timber and ornament dragged onto a hill to make of a raider's pride a pavilion for women to sit and pass laws. He found a boy with a wooden leg racing a lizard lion and a grandmother's hand on the back of his neck to correct his hubris. He found a hall where the old grudges had been hung up to dry and had, like linen, become less heavy for being aired. "You have made enemies," said the princess, "a woman with knives for eyes and laughter for a weapon sharper still. Good. Their grief has needed a chair for so long that without it they will have to learn to sit on the ground with the rest of us and find out if food tastes better lower. It does. The tongue tells us this. The faith will foam. The reach will preen. The stormlands will storm. The Vale will call anything steep a virtue. The North will pretend that bread is the sacrament they invented. Dorne will sell you oranges for twice what they're worth because you deserve it. Will your dragons pick off the men who try to pick off you? They hunt deer when they can," Jon said. "Prophecy makes bad meat." She laughed. "We have no prophecy here, only memory. We remember when dragons came before, and we remember that when they left, we blamed them for our own failures. Do not ask my people to kneel. Ask them to bring wine and a map. They will surprise you in ways that leave you neither poorer nor charmed, which is the right way to be surprised." He asked for wine and a map. He left with a road laid out in ink over the dunes that would catch the wind and make a kind of music near midnight and guide caravans without a single stone being moved. He left with 6 girls who had decided they were engineers because no one had told them the word, and the absence of a word is sometimes a doorway. He left with the knowledge that when the next fever came, it would not come alone. On a night when the sea had lain down so flat that stars kept their reflections even where the oars cut, a ship found him. He stood on a spit of land no map had considered important and watched the lanterns approach, and knew the way the ship moved that it was not one of his grain men or one of Osh's. The lantern at the prow flicked 3 times and then twice and then once, the old Sellswords code for "we come without contract with a story." He waited. Ghost lifted his head, alert. Drogon eased his weight and threatened to be ornery about the notion of visitors past dark. They put a boat over. The oars whispered. The men in it were not men he knew, and also he knew them. Shaved heads, the careful economy of motion, the stillness the body learns when it has been taught that desire is a liability. Not unsullied, but from the same city once. From many such cities. Men who had unlearned ownership but not discipline. At the bow a woman stood, bearing herself as if the sea had dressed her. She wore no sigil. She had a scar under her jaw that looked like a rumor and eyes that did not flinch from the dragon upon the shingle. She stepped ashore and bowed, not deep enough to be ceremony, deep enough to be sincere. "Noth," she said, and that made a kind of wind where no wind was. "We come from Noth." He felt her words the way a man feels a pain ease years after he has forgotten the name of the wound. He saw a boy on a ship with no chains left and a captain who had learned his gentleness late. He saw gray worms standing at the rail, eyes trying to understand what waiting meant when it was no longer a tactic. "How is he?" Jon asked, and heard how his voice rucked up at the edges like cloth not yet ironed smooth. "Better at fishing than at sleeping," she said. "Better at planting than at letting others plant without him. He does not kill. He pulls weeds. He frowns at them as at old lies. Sometimes in the evening he says a name. He thinks he is speaking to no one. He is wrong. She looked at the dragons as if at weather that had finally remembered what season it belonged to. When we heard there are dragons again, we waited to see if they would come to us with flags and claims. They did not. So we came to you and asked nothing. We came to tell you that a place exists where men do not kneel because no one has asked them to for a long time. Jon had to swallow. The swallow hurt and helped. Tell him. He stopped. Words were a forge. They needed heat and hammer and a willingness to ruin the first 5 things you made before the 6th bore weight. Tell him we are building things that require watchmen who do not want to own the tower. Tell him he taught that lesson to me without ever meaning to. Tell him no. Tell him nothing. He has the right to make his own story without my ghost walking through it. Sit. Eat. The bread is honest. They ate. She slept on the beach between dragon and wolf, as naturally as a woman sleeps between weather and the road when both are friendly. And in the morning the boat shoved off and the ship turned its face to the west and then to the south. Jon watched until the lantern winked out in daylight. He felt something unclench that he had not known was clenched. Seasons made their circuit. The dragons learned to share sky with migratory birds. The conclave learned to argue without thinking argument a war. Maesters learned to write ledgers that counted mortality not as an inevitability but as a debt to be paid with work. The Iron Bank learned to hang a picture of a table where men with rough hands ate with men whose hands had softened, and to call it good business. Then, because a story without peril is a lie, a rumor grew in the vale that a boy had been born with a tuft of silver hair, and that a hedge which had said the dragons would eat him unless he sat a throne. Men carry tinder for such rumors in the pockets of their fear. It lit at once. Lords who had learned to be comfortable standing shoulder to shoulder began to take a half step back, as if preparing to remember how to bow. Merchants began to hoard grain because hoarding grain is a way to make prophecy feed you. The faith muttered. The citadel wrote careful paragraphs that said nothing and worried their own mouths chapped. Jon rode. He did not bring the conclave with him. He brought the dragons and the wolf and a scribe from Old Town who had learned to look like a boy and write like a woman, and a smith from King's Landing who was proud of his fingernails because they had been black for a year and this meant he was useful. They camped in a mountain meadow where the grass grew thick as comfort, and let the rumor find them because rumors love to believe they are hunters when they are only scent. They found the child easily because his mother did not hide him. She was a girl with the courage of someone who had not yet been asked to consider the cost of it. The boy had hair that had not decided what it wanted to be and a fist that punched the air whenever anyone came near, as if asserting his right to exist with every breath. She told the same story 7 different ways because fear makes storytellers of us all and no one remembers which is the first draft. Jon listened to every version as if it were the right one. He looked at the boy and did not see a throne. He saw a mouth that would always be hungry because mouths are honest. He saw a rumor learning to take on legs and run. There is no curse in him, Marwyn's scribe said, very gentle, very sure. There is no room in him yet for a curse. We could make one by speaking one. Let us not. Jon held out his hands. The mother hesitated the way a hawk hesitates before leaving the glove. She handed the child over. Jon cradled him and looked into his face and saw nothing holy. Relief washed through him so fast his knees nearly forgot what they were supposed to do. He kissed the boy's forehead because the world had reminded him that this was a thing adults did when they were still willing to be honest. The dragons came near because something new was being made, and new things drew them the way heat draws. Drogon's breath fogged the air. The boy kicked. Ashwing lowered her head and let the child grab a scale as if it were a bell rope. Ember made the sound she had made over wells when the water was good. The meadow sighed in a wind that had waited for this. Men who had followed the rumor to watch a king be made looked at one another, then at their feet, then at the sky, then away. Some of them laughed because embarrassment is a good cure for superstition. Some of them went home and kept the story anyway because stories lodge in bone and are revealed only by slow chisels. Jon gave the mother a purse and a map with the road drawn thicker than it needed to be between her village and the nearest granary. He sat and ate with her and asked her how she made stew when meat was thin and learned 3 tricks he had never known and would pass along because that was what rule looked like now. The boy grew up to be a blacksmith's apprentice with a knack for dazzling horses, which is to say he learned how to stand safely where power is nervous. No throne ate him. He ate well and married a woman who did not like crowns because they are silly and get in the way when you kiss. News came like weather and was treated like it. A flood in the riverlands and men who had once burned roads laying stones with their own hands because they were tired of waiting for someone else to do the work. A fire in Lannisport contained by a dragon who learned to lift smoke upward and press sparks into the bay with his wingtips. A winter in the north that bit harder than forecast, and a road scraped clear every third day by men who sang about bread instead of kings. A ship from Karth that turned around at Dorne because the charts were wrong and the captain had no patience for cities that reinvented their names. An archmaester who died while reading and left a note that said, "Tell them not to be afraid of dying the right death. We have little say in numbers, much in posture." He grew gray. He learned that ghosts only leave when you have given them enough work to tire them out. He learned that love returns by means of other people's good fortune, and you must not begrudge them the currency. He learned that Ghost would one day not rise when he rose, and that this would be a kind of night he could walk through only once. He learned to accept that a dragon would always grow beyond his reach, no matter how wide his arms. On a spring day as thin and new as a child's wrist, he climbed the slope above the city that had once been a crown and now was simply a place with doors. The granary roof was warm under him. The three younger dragons lay in a tangle, flicking their tails and making small rude noises at the flies. Drogon had taken to drowsing where the sound of women arguing over prices could reach him. It soothed him in ways fire never had. Jon sat with his back against the old stone and closed his eyes and listened. The city breathed. It had done so before, but never without a throne in its chest to make its breath a command. He thought of Dany not as a queen and not as a woman he had loved badly, but as a girl who had walked into a fire and come out and believed this meant something holy because no one had told her a second thing could be true. That it might also mean she needed to be held by so. Mion who would tell her she could choose gentleness without betraying her birthright. He spoke her name once, not to summon or to apologize, but to make sure his mouth still knew how to shape it. He slept without dreaming. When he woke, the shadows had moved 3 dragon lengths across the roof, and the sun had learned a little more about its job. He stood and stretched and felt each joint report in with an honest groan. On the street below, a boy ran with a nail between his teeth, proud of not dropping it. A woman slapped his head lightly and took the nail and handed him 2 so he would learn balance. Laughter stitched the air and held. He walked down into it knowing that nothing he had done was permanent and everything he had done was worth doing again tomorrow. He walked with the knowledge that thrones grow back like weeds and must be pulled like them. Regularly, without ceremony, hands dirty, back sore. He walked with his palms ready for the weight of a hammer and his mouth ready to ask where it would best be used. Overhead, the dragons turned their slow, deliberate circles. They had learned no king's language, only sky. Their shadows crossed his path and then crossed it again. And in that shadow, he felt something like blessing, which is to say not absolution and not command. Only the world loading light upon him and trusting him to carry it as far as he could before handing it on. He went to work. The day obliged him. The table filled. No one counted chairs. Bread went where it was needed. The nails held. And for a long time afterward, when children asked their mothers why it was that no one had sat upon a throne for as long as anyone could remember, the mothers told them, because we were busy, and the children accepted that answer as the only reasonable one, and ran to fetch water and came back with full buckets and a dragon's shadow across their shoulders that felt like nothing but weather on a day when weather had chosen not to be cruel.